Poland sentenced more Nazi war criminals to death for a single concentration camp than Nuremberg sentenced for the entire Nazi high command. One camp, hundreds of guards, and in December 1944, before the war in Europe had even ended, 6 of them stood on gallows built by Polish carpenters, in front of a crowd the size of a small city, less than a mile from the gas chambers where they'd worked. Some of the crowd cheered, some of them threw stones at the bodies, and this was just the beginning. Over the next 37 years, the hunt for the staff of this one camp would stretch from a muddy field outside Lublin to a quiet house in Queens, New York. Her name was Hermine Braunsteiner. In 1964, she was living in Maspeth, Queens, married to an American named Russell Ryan, working quietly, raising a stepdaughter, going to church on Sundays. Her neighbors called her a devoted homemaker. Nobody in Queens knew her other name, the one prisoners had given her 20 years earlier, in a language most Americans couldn't read. They called her Kobiła, the mare, because she killed people by stomping them to death with steel-toed jackboots. And in 1964, she was about to be found by a journalist who read her name in a stack of German court documents nobody else had bothered to translate. To understand how Hermine Braunsteiner ended up in a housewife's kitchen in Queens, you have to go back to a patch of flat, boggy land 2 miles outside Lublin, Poland. In October 1941, German engineers started building a camp there. Officially, it was called Konzentrationslager Lublin. Unofficially, everyone just called it by the name of the neighborhood next to it, Majdanek. Here's what made Majdanek different from almost every other death camp the Nazis built. They didn't hide it. Auschwitz sat behind forests and fences, 30 miles from the nearest city. Majdanek sat inside Lublin's city limits. Residents could see the watchtowers from their windows. They could smell the crematoria from their kitchens. Streetcars ran past the perimeter fence on a normal daily route, and passengers looked out the window at prisoners in striped uniforms doing forced labor, close enough to make eye contact. The people of Lublin didn't need liberators to tell them what was happening. They'd been watching it happen for 3 years. By the time it was finished, Majdanek held Soviet prisoners of war, Polish political prisoners, and, starting in 1942, Jews from across occupied Poland, marked for the camp's gas chambers, which ran on both Zyklon B and carbon monoxide piped in from truck engines. Historians have spent decades revising the death toll as archives opened, and the honest number is still debated. Estimates run from the tens of thousands into the low hundreds of thousands. What isn't debated is this: it was one of the deadliest patches of ground in occupied Poland, and it was run day to day by roughly 1,000 SS men and women who rotated through its guard towers, its barracks, and its bathhouses over 3 years. And here is the detail that made Majdanek different from every other camp trial in history. On July 22, 1944, the camp had barely 3 weeks left to run, because the Red Army was coming faster than anyone in Berlin expected. The SS at other camps had time to burn the paperwork, blow up the crematoria, march the prisoners west on death marches, and erase the evidence. At Majdanek, they didn't. The Soviets arrived so quickly that the camp staff fled in a panic, leaving behind the gas chambers standing, the crematorium ovens still warm, warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with the shoes of the dead, and, most damning of all, filing cabinets full of the camp's own internal records. Majdanek became the first major Nazi camp ever captured essentially intact. Soviet and Polish investigators walked into a crime scene the Nazis hadn't had time to clean up, and that meant something no other camp could offer in 1944. Living, breathing evidence, sitting there, waiting for a courtroom. Within 4 months, the Soviets and the Polish Committee of National Liberation put together something that had never happened before in this war: an actual trial. Not a tribunal planned for some future peace conference. A trial, right now, while the war was still going on. It would be held in Lublin, a short walk from the camp itself, on November 27, 1944, months before anyone in London or Washington had even settled on the word Nuremberg. 6 Majdanek staff members sat in a Lublin courtroom charged with mass murder. This was the first Nazi war crimes trial in history. Not the most famous, the first. Judges heard testimony from survivors who had been in the camp weeks earlier, some of them still wearing the same striped uniforms because they had nothing else to wear. The trial lasted 6 days. The verdict came back guilty on all 6. The sentence, death by hanging. And here's where it gets almost unbelievable. The court didn't wait weeks for an appeals process. The executions were carried out the very next day, December 3, 1944, on a gallows erected near the camp itself. Polish authorities didn't hide this one either. They announced it publicly, and an estimated crowd of tens of thousands of Polish civilians came to watch. Witnesses described people climbing trees and rooftops to get a better view. When the trapdoors dropped, parts of the crowd cheered. Some threw stones at the bodies as they hung there. After 3 years of watching the smoke rise from those crematoria chimneys, Lublin wanted to see this with its own eyes. But 6 men hanging in a field was not justice for a camp that had been run by close to 1,000 SS staff over 3 years. It was barely a beginning. And what almost nobody in that cheering crowd realized was that most of the people actually responsible, the officers who designed the system, the guards who ran the gas chambers day after day, the commandants who signed the transport orders, were already scattering across Europe, shaving their mustaches, burning their SS tattoos with acid, and building new identities. The hunt that would eventually catch them wouldn't finish for another 37 years. Over the next 4 years, Polish courts in Lublin didn't stop with that first trial. In a series of follow-up proceedings running from 1944 through 1948, prosecutors worked their way through camp personnel records, survivor testimony, and captured SS files, identifying and trying hundreds more former Majdanek staff, guards, capos, clerks, and administrators. Taken together across every wave of Majdanek-related trials, historians count roughly 800 individuals connected to the camp's operation who were eventually identified for investigation or prosecution, making Majdanek the single most prosecuted concentration camp staff in Nazi history. No other camp comes close to that number of people held individually accountable. But numbers on a page don't tell you what these trials actually sounded like inside the courtroom. Survivors stood up, one after another, and did something almost nobody had done in a courtroom before. They identified their torturers by name, in person, under oath. One woman who had survived Majdanek's Feld 3 barracks testified about watching guards select children for the gas chambers by simply pointing. No paperwork, no process, just a raised finger deciding who lived through the next hour. A former prisoner testified that guards ran what they nicknamed sport, forcing exhausted, starving prisoners to do calisthenics in the mud for hours as a form of entertainment, until people collapsed and were beaten where they fell. This wasn't abstract testimony about a system. This was survivors pointing across a courtroom at specific human beings and saying, "That one did this to me." And some of the accused sitting in that courtroom weren't men. That surprised people at the time, and it still surprises audiences today. Majdanek employed dozens of female SS guards, known as Aufseherinnen, who ran entire sections of the women's camp. Survivor testimony described several of them as being every bit as violent as their male counterparts. Some survivors said, worse. One name came up again and again in survivor accounts. A young Austrian woman barely in her 20s, who prisoners nicknamed the Mare for the way she killed people by kicking and stomping them with her boots. Her real name was Hermine Braunsteiner, and in 1944, when Lublin was hanging its first 6 defendants, Braunsteiner wasn't anywhere near that gallows. She had already been transferred out of Majdanek months earlier, moved west to a different camp, still in an SS uniform, still years away from facing a single question in a courtroom. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The war crimes tribunal machinery shifted to Nuremberg, and the world's attention went with it. Nuremberg tried the top of the Nazi hierarchy, the generals, the ministers, the architects of the whole system, and it sentenced 12 of them to death. 12 for the entire apparatus of the Nazi state. Meanwhile, quietly, without cameras, Polish courts kept working through the much longer list of names connected to just one camp. And here is the fact that should stop you. By the time all the Majdanek-related trials in Poland were finished, More individuals had been sentenced to death for running that single camp than Nuremberg sentenced to death for running the entire Third Reich. But justice, in a devastated post-war Europe, was never going to be clean or complete. Records had been burned, witnesses had been killed, and thousands of former camp staff simply vanished into the chaos, some hiding under false names inside Germany, some fleeing to South America along the same escape routes used by men like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann, and some doing something far bolder, getting on a boat, crossing an ocean, and building an entirely new life in the United States, where almost nobody was checking SS service records against immigration paperwork. That's exactly what Hermine Braunsteiner did. After the war, she was actually caught once, tried by an Austrian court in 1949 for her role at a different camp, Ravensbrück, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. She served her time, and when she walked out, Austrian authorities simply let her go, with no further investigation into her earlier service at Majdanek, because at that point, nobody had connected all the pieces of her file. In 1959, she met an American construction worker named Russell Ryan while he was traveling in Austria. They married. She became Hermine Ryan, an American citizen, and moved into a modest house in Maspeth, Queens. For the next several years, she was, by every appearance, an ordinary immigrant housewife in New York City. What Hermine Braunsteiner didn't know was that a journalist named Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who had turned Nazi hunting into a lifelong mission, had spent years cross-referencing old trial documents, immigration records, and survivor testimony from multiple countries. In 1964, a New York Times reporter working from Leeds connected to Wiesenthal's network tracked her address in Queens and knocked on her door. When he told her he knew who she'd been at Majdanek, Braunsteiner reportedly broke down and admitted it on the spot. One of the only times in this entire story that a perpetrator confessed without being forced to under cross-examination. It still took 9 more years to get her into a courtroom. The United States didn't yet have a clear legal framework for extraditing a naturalized citizen over crimes committed under a foreign flag 2 decades earlier. This case would end up helping to build that framework. Legal battles dragged through the American courts from 1971 to 1973. And in 1973, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan became the first American citizen in history ever extradited from the United States, specifically to face Nazi war crimes charges. Reporters camped outside her Queens house for the story. Her husband, who by his own account had no idea about her past when he married her, stood by her anyway, all the way to the airport. She was flown to West Germany to face trial alongside 15 other former Majdanek staff, a joint proceeding that would become known as the Düsseldorf Majdanek trial. It began in November 1975, and it turned into something almost nobody expected, the longest, most expensive Nazi war crimes trial in West German history. It ran for nearly 6 years. Judges heard from more than 300 witnesses, many of them survivors flown in from Israel, the United States, and across Europe, to describe, once again, decades after the fact, exactly what had happened to them inside that camp. Some of the accused sat through years of testimony in total silence. On June 30, 1981, nearly 37 years after the very first Majdanek trial hanged 6 men in front of a cheering crowd in Lublin, the Düsseldorf court delivered its verdict on Hermine Braunsteiner, guilty of murder and complicity in the deaths of hundreds of prisoners, including direct participation in selections that sent people straight to the gas chambers. She was sentenced to life in prison. She would serve part of that sentence before being released on medical grounds due to failing health, and she died in 1999, the last major figure from Majdanek's staff to ever face a courtroom for what happened there. So what happened to everyone else? This is the part of the story that doesn't have a satisfying ending, and you deserve to hear that plainly instead of a Hollywood version of it. Of the roughly 800 individuals connected to Majdanek's operation across its history, a large share were eventually tried in one proceeding or another. But historians and legal scholars are blunt about the rest. A meaningful number were never caught at all. Some records were destroyed in the final chaotic weeks of the war, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of accounting. Some men changed their names once, in Germany, and never had to change them again. West Germany's own post-war legal system was, for years, staffed in places by former Nazi Party members who were, to put it gently, not in a hurry to prosecute their former colleagues. Justice for Majdanek was real, and it was larger in scale than almost any other camps, but it was never complete, and everyone involved in building these cases knew it. The camp itself never really left, because the SS fled Majdanek in such a hurry in July 1944. The Polish government was able to do something that happened at almost no other Nazi camp: preserve it, almost exactly as it was found, as a permanent museum. Today, if you walk through Majdanek, you will see the gas chambers still standing. You will see the crematorium ovens, and in one building, behind glass, you will see a mountain of shoes, tens of thousands of them, taken from prisoners on arrival, still sitting in the same warehouse where SS clerks catalogued them 80 years ago. It is, by most accounts from people who visited, one of the most unbearable rooms in any museum in the world. And even now, more than 80 years later, this story isn't fully finished. In the decades since the war, Polish archaeologists and historians have continued refining death toll estimates as new archival material surfaces, revising numbers that propaganda and wartime chaos had distorted in both directions. Individual case files on former guards have kept trickling out of archives in Germany, Poland, and the former Soviet Union well into the 21st century, occasionally still triggering new investigations into elderly former camp staff living quietly in Germany, some of them prosecuted in their 90s, decades after anyone assumed the window for justice had closed. Which brings us back to that crowd outside Lublin in December 1944. Watching 6 men hang on a gallows built in a matter of days, some of them cheering, some of them throwing stones. They didn't know it yet, but they were watching the opening scene of a manhunt that would stretch across 3 continents and 37 years, through Austrian courtrooms, through a quiet street in Queens, through a 6-year trial in Düsseldorf that outlasted entire marriages and careers. Most of the roughly 800 people who ran that camp were, eventually, found, named, and held to account in one courtroom or another, in numbers no other single Nazi camp ever matched. But somewhere in that number, there are names that were never read out in any courtroom at all. Guards who took new identities and simply died, decades later, as somebody else, in some quiet house, in some quiet town, with neighbors who had no idea what they'd once done for a living. Majdanek's reckoning was one of the largest in the history of the Holocaust. It was also, like almost everything else about that war, incomplete. And that's the part this story leaves you sitting with. For every Hermann Braunsteiner tracked down in a kitchen in Queens, there may still be a name that got away with it entirely, and we will simply never know whose it was.